This is Georgia Focus. I'm Scott Kimbler on the Georgia News Network. This week we are speaking with Ed Payne, a Georgia-based writer who has taken on the task of bringing a little girl's dream of being a successful author to life. Ed has been enveloped in a years-long journey of taking the stories from the mind of a young girl who lost her life and bringing those stories into the lives of other young people. Today we talk about the children's book series affectionately named Vail's Tales.
In its basis, I'm helping a family fulfill the wish of a child of theirs. Now, Vail is a 9-year-old girl who I had the pleasure of writing these children's books with. The thing is, I never got to meet Vail because in 2016, Vail passed away. She had a very rare form of myocarditis, and in effect, it had no symptoms, and she went to bed one night, and she didn't wake up in the morning. But what prompted the stories that we're talking about is that literally the night before, she grabbed her mom's hand, I guess as she often did, and she looked at her and said, "Mama, I want to be an author someday. I want to be a writer." And so that ultimately inspired the stories of hers that we're telling now. She apparently, as a 6, 7, 8, and 9-year-old, was very prolific in writing little stories, left them all over the house. Some they've discovered since she died. And those stories are the inspiration for the now 8 stories we've written in 3 books that make up Vail's Tales.
So she would write these stories, I would assume, on construction paper with crayon or pen or what have you. Did she bind them and make like little books out of them?
Yeah, she really did. A lot of them were school assignments, where, they were pre-printed things. But, she would write them. It was clear to me that some of these stories were very particular assignments, like write a story about a horse or a cat or whatever, those sorts of stories. And then, she would write her title to it, and she would take construction paper and she'd staple them together. And so, the collection of stories have come from her teacher that had saved a number of them. But literally, even within the last several months, her parents have found stories just stashed around the house, things that she had written over the years she was writing them, and they're kind of like new treasures that they find. And it makes it very special for them because they're, even though she's been gone, a number of years now, they're still getting to experience the stories, that she's told. And, it's kind of a way of keeping her around, I guess, in one sense, because they can, they know her voice and, they probably can almost hear, the stories in their head with her telling them.
Now, from what I understand, the mother had made an effort to tell these stories, but somehow or another you became later involved with this. What is that journey that has taken a young girl scribbling on construction paper to now these books being made available through you as that conduit?
Yeah, it's never been lost on me that I'm being exactly that, and that I'm also part of their grieving process. I'm taking something that's entirely precious to them, and they're entrusting me with it to, tell those stories. Initially, the 4 stories that made up Vail's Tales, the very first Vail's Tales book, were stories that they literally just made copies of, scanned them, with the misspellings and all that you would expect with, a 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old to make, and literally just scanned them and had them bound and sold them. But they discovered that they wanted it to be more. I guess ultimately they decided they wanted it to be more. And that's how I eventually came in. The stories, you kind of see at certain points in your life, that something happened, and then you look back at how did this all come together? Because, it's a lot of different branches. It even, it reminds me of something one of my pastors said once, like he said, sometimes, one of you will come up to me and compliment me on my sermon. And he'd go, "How long did you work on that?" And he'd go, "Been working on that all of my life." because all of the experiences that we have, ultimately go into where we are now. So in 2013, I wrote published my first children's story called The Daily Rounds of a Hound, which was based on a dog that we adopted from the shelter who gave us puppies 3 weeks after we got her, and literally 9 puppies. So that was never intending to be a children's author, but that inspired me, and I wrote a story. And it really just kind of sat in the drawer for a while, or in the computer file, and I never did really anything for it or with it. But I kind of kept feeling like it was good, or at least good enough that maybe I could do something with it. And since I worked at CNN and was a writer at CNN for CNN.com, I knew writers and I knew people who could judge, whether I had done a good job with it or not. So I took it into them and handed it out. And I also knew that I knew them well enough that if I gave them my story and they looked at it and they go, yeah, Ed, that's nice. I'd know that, oh, okay, I get it. It served its purpose. It got something, out of my heart and my head onto paper. But the feedback was very positive. And one of the people I worked with told me, what are you going to do with it? And I go, well, it's a children's story. It would have to be illustrated. And she said, don't know if you're interested. I have a sister who does that, who is a graphic artist. She hasn't done a children's story before, but she's going to be here in a couple of weeks here in Atlanta. And I go, that's fine. I'll talk with her. And so we met a few weeks later, literally spent 20 minutes together, and then spent the next year and a half putting together the first children's book that became The Daily Rounds of a Hound. And so that's the first step. That's the first thing that had to happen. First of all, I had to be, a children's writer, a children's author. Because of those connections at CNN, somebody else I worked with at CNN is a cousin to the family in Texas, to Vail's mother is her cousin. So she knew that her cousin was looking to do something with Vail's stories. So that's where the connection was made. She said, I know you're wanting to do something more with it. I know somebody that I worked with at CNN who has written a children's book. Maybe you want to talk. Maybe you want to get together. So 5 years ago, we started to get together. That's when the genesis of, the Vail's Tales as they exist now began. And so had a phone call with Vail's mom, Susan Chance, and we talked. Several weeks later, she was in Atlanta. We met, talked. I didn't know, I wasn't totally sure how it went. I mean, I thought we got along fine, but I learned later, and she said this in a television interview, and it warmed my heart because it made me really feel good about myself. She goes, as soon as I met him, I knew he was the person we needed to have do this.
Well, that's an encouraging feedback to get.
Yeah, and it's great to have that. So because I kind of had my team, I mean, there's just 2 of us, but I had my team, Britt Sekulic, who is my illustrator. I told Susan, I said, hey, with Britt, you're going to be your book. It's not like we were working with a publisher. We were doing this ourselves, and they wanted that oversight. They wanted their own oversight on this project. And I go, you can do what you want. Obviously, I'll be the words, and we'll work with that. I said, personally, I wouldn't work with anyone else because Britt has always not only done a great job just illustrating, but she's never taken away from anything that was written and actually enhanced it. And when you're trying to tell a story, both with words and visually, which, is so important with a children's story, you have to, you want that. You want it to be that. So anyway, that's kind of the long way around. We had my CNN connections, we had the children's stories connections, and then we had the relationship between a CNN coworker and the family in Texas that kind of got this whole thing rolling. And then, then there's actually, developing the story after that, the stories that we got.
So when you develop Vail's tales, are they word for word her stories, or do you correct the grammar, or what exactly is your role other than bringing her story to life? What is your role in bringing her story?
Right. The way it works, it depends on the story. Some stories are better developed than others. What I told Vail's mom was that what I will promise you in doing these stories, that they will all be inspired by what Vail has written and what I'm able to learn of her, based on how she writes and knowing your family. So that's where I start with it. I always call it, I don't know, reimagining, maybe. It just depends. Some of the stories stand really well on their own, but we wanted to make a rhyming children's book, so it's written in verse. We're wanting to, like I said, be true to what Vail meant, but also, they wanted me because the stories weren't where they wanted them yet. And so they wanted me to take my experience as a children's writer and as just a writer in general, and make the stories more complete. I personally think it's always good to have a story that has some sort of moral, or, it's got to be more than just words. It's got to touch your heart. It's got to maybe give you hope, maybe make you smile, maybe make you cry a little bit. But that's what we look for. Like I said, there are some stories that were pretty complete, and there was one story that was very simple that actually, from the feedback I've gotten, may be one of our most popular stories. And the story was essentially, if I were a tree, I would be a stool. That was 90% of the story. And then what she went on to, in the way, I think she was 6 at the time she wrote this story. Then she started talking about going to church, because her family is very involved with their church. And she goes, if I were a tree, I would be a stool. And I love my life. I'm fortunate. I love going to church, was really the rest of it. And it wasn't much longer than that. And I'm going, well, why did she say that? And I just started thinking, because it just struck me that it was very two separate parts. It was like, I want to be a stool. And it's like, well, why do you want to be a stool? Okay. And then she talks about church and the faith that, a 6 or 7 year old girl might have. And I came to the conclusion that stools always are helpful. You sit on them, you use them to stand on, you might sit on one to play a piano.
Yeah, they hold you up, they prevent you from falling.
Yeah, so they're helpful, and that kind of tied in with her faith, because, in the Christian faith, often, there's a discussion of being a servant of some sort. And that's spelled out, in numerous Bible stories. And I think that's where she's, what she was thinking about, without ever being able to talk to her, without ever knowing her. And it turned out to be a great little story that was just really kind of a simple story, of faith. But, it also, it just kind of made you feel good, because you could kind of go with, how you could be helpful as a stool, what you could do with the stool. And you don't really think about it, but, what stools and chairs do in our lives. I mean, we're both sitting in chairs right now, and it's, we either have to be standing with our legs getting tired or sitting on the ground, which could make parts of us go numb, and so, anyway, that's an example of a story that wasn't particularly well developed, that I had to kind of figure out what Vail was thinking about and go with it from there.
There must be a tremendous amount of empathy you must have to be able to put yourself in the place of a 6-year-old girl.
Well, it does help that I have 2 daughters. Neither one of them are 6 anymore, but I have raised a couple of girls, so that probably helped. I was able to look at pictures of her, and of course, I talked with the family and got a feeling for what she was like, how she acted, what things were important in her life. My understanding is that she was one of these girls that would collect friends. She didn't look at what. She was more about the heart, I guess. That might be a better way to to shortchange where I was going. She wasn't so concerned about popular kids, although I think she was probably one of those gregarious girls that was fairly popular. But she'd kind of collect friends, and I had one daughter that was particularly like that, where she would, she decided that you were going to be my friend, and then you were going to be her friend, and and just because of the empathy and the love and the kind of the gathering in, that she was able to to pull those people in. And one of the stories in the first book was called, this isn't the title of it, but essentially it was kind of a directive on how to be a good friend, and again, and why that was important, and why, 2 or 3 people could be friends, and that didn't mean, another 2 or 3 people couldn't join the group. It didn't have to be an exclusive club, because there was love that, could be shared with everyone.
Right, and just keep multiplying as more kids join that fold.
Exactly.
So when was the first Vail's Tales published?
Came out in 2019. We had the debut party at a benefit in Texas where the family lives on November, I don't remember the date exactly, but it was November 19th. It was the week before Thanksgiving. And that's when it came out. And then, we were just getting hints of the pandemic at that point. We were trying to figure out what this coronavirus is, and so it wasn't too many months later where, we were all under quarantine and all that. So it was a great start to the book. It got a good start. I should back up just a second. That was kind of like the foundation debut of the book. The family started, because in their daughter's memory, started a foundation called the Friends of Vail, that they used the money and the proceeds raised by this book to go to causes they care about. Sometimes they're educational. There's various things, and the website describes all of those. That was like the big public unveiling of the book. But actually, the book came out in the fall of 2019, right at the very end of August, beginning of September. So anyway, that's when it was published. So it took about a year and a half to get it together. But then we ran into the pandemic, and it took another 3 years to get the second book going, just for a number of reasons. I mean, we had always worked long distance because my illustrator and our illustrator, for these projects, lives in California. And so, we were always.
So, you have you in Georgia, the illustrator in California, and
the family in Texas.
Family in Texas. Wow.
Yeah,
you certainly cover a lot of ground.
Well, and we did, and that was, that's not why it took long. I mean, part of it was the pandemic, because we just didn't know what was going on. Everything was topsy-turvy. But then, life happens too. We had things going on in our lives, too, that made it take a little bit longer. And then we, decided there were changes we needed to make as we were learning the process better. And what was going to be a second Vail's book actually became a second and third Vail's Tales book.
Yeah, I was just noticing that on our list, that the Vail's Tales is the first one, And the second and third have very catchy titles. Volume 2, I believe, is Fishin' for Trouble, and Volume 3 being Party Animal. So these are continuing. So apparently you've gotten positive feedback and some success with these stories.
Yeah, there have been times when all three of the books have been number one in various categories on the Amazon sales charts. I'm not going to tell you that it's a New York Times bestseller because that wouldn't be accurate. But that being said, they have done, they've done well, and we've been very fortunate. We've had we've been fortunate to have good news coverage, I guess, because not only do we have really good stories, but we have a very good backstory. The story,
it is a very heartwarming story that this little girl wanted to do this, and her family, through you and through others, has picked up the torch and helping her accomplish that.
Yeah, it's special. It's special. You don't. I wouldn't call it. It's an opportunity to be involved. I didn't want to say it just like it's an opportunity. Like that sounds kind of crass. Like, crass. Well, this is interesting. I'll jump on that. And it hasn't been about that. It's as much a heart project, as it is, a writing assignment. Because you could look at it that way. But when you have a chance to go to Texas, like I have a couple of times now, and talk with the community there, and how they support, the foundation, how they've supported the family over the years, because for them, it's not just a story. They knew this little girl. They continue to know the family, and, they continue to, support them and invest in them. And, again, community is the only word I can really think of, because it's, it's not like just the city. They have a community of people who really back this, who are really, behind them. And like I said, they, Vail is somebody who they knew and, was a living, breathing, gregarious little girl who, lived in North Texas.
Now, I gather that with each volume that this is a compilation of stories. How many stories do we have per volume?
Well, the very first book had 4 stories to it, and then what was going to be the second book also had 4 stories, and then we determined that for various reasons it was just too long to put in one book.
It's kind of a good problem to have.
Well, it is. In that sense. But if you're just talking about practicalities, like how many pages can you put in a book and be able to sell it and to have it make sense, from a cost versus what it costs to sell it. And again, it's not profit driven all in all. But the money goes to a foundation, but they're not trying to, be bestsellers. They're just trying to honor their daughter and then use her memory to benefit others.
So I understand that she was 6 when she started writing these stories because of the age that she would be in school when they have you write a story for this and for that. And she was 9 when she passed away. What is the target audience for Vail's Tales books? And how exactly do you market the books to that audience?
Yeah, so the audience is, I guess it's probably anyone in elementary school. I guess it just depends. They're rhyming children's stories. They're meant to be fun, but they're also meant to have a message. So that's kind of where we start with it. When we go back to Texas, and I've done some readings for the entire elementary school. So, I guess potentially, it could go through 5th grade. I would say primarily it would be, pre-readers that are learning, to speak, where the parents could read them the stories, probably through maybe 2nd or 3rd grade. The marketing, is very, very simple. It's social media. But it's also through the channels, that the family has. We've got hardcover and, softcover paperbacks. And you can get both on Amazon. You can also get them through Barnes & Noble. If you just search for Vail's Tales, VAIL''S Tales, TALES, you'll find them on Amazon. And that's really primarily it. To find out more about them in general, you can go to the Friends of Vail Foundation website, which is just simply friendsofvail.com.
We have been speaking with Ed Payne, co-author of the popular children's book series Vail's Tales. Now up to 3 volumes of short stories, Vail's Tales is available through major book retailers, Amazon, and a local library branch near you. You can also learn more about Vail Chance and the foundation founded by her parents, Susan and Chad Chance, at friendsofvail.com. This has been Georgia Focus. Join us next week on this same station. I'm Scott Kimbler with the Georgia News Network.